So the balance data slate and the Warhammer 40k points changes for autumn are in, and it seems that Games Workshop have gone in hard. This one's going to be an absolutely enormous overhaul of 40k as we know it, enormous buffs to the struggling factions and big nerfs to the top ones, and some core rules changes thrown in as well. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking through Games Workshop's recent balanced data slate for Warhammer 40k. Every single faction's major rules and points changes, plus the core rules changes to the game in detail. As I mentioned in the intro, this change really has been a pretty enormous one. I feel like Games Workshop reacted to most people out there hoping that they'd do something at least fairly major to the game. 10th edition since it's come out has sort of felt like it's in a bit of a beta testing phase maybe. Lots of interesting rules thrown out there, but some factions were just ridiculously stronger than other ones, and in a lot of the factions that were doing kind of okay, their internal balance was very off indeed. The major strokes of this balanced data slate are three main sections. There's core rules changes to the actual main rules of Warhammer 40k, and a fair few of those as well. Maybe the main ones to Devastating Wounds, Free Stratagems, Overwatch, Towering, and a couple more. The points changes truly are ambitious, rather than just going for their usual sort of method of chipping away at a few major or minor units that either needed buffs or nerfs. They really have gone through each faction and changed about half the points values, sometimes more. I feel like most of the points changes are pretty sensible and should be reasonably good for internal balance and external balance versus other factions, though there are a few weird ones of course. Then added to all that, there's some rules changes for the data slate to certain armies, some of them with basically new army rules like the Death Guard or the Leagues of Votann, others helping or hindering certain units or stratagems, and a couple of new army-wide nerfs. It does seem the most part of that text leak that we had the other day was broadly accurate. Doesn't look like there's any further change to indirect fire or anything like that, but a lot of the other stuff that they'd hinted had turned out to be right, things like squad size changes, a change to Devastating Wounds, and a few more things. First up, let's talk through the core rules changes, and first up we have the Devastating Wounds change, something that's really quite a big deal in 40k, seeing as a lot of factions' most powerful options do revolve around this mechanic and handing out mortal wounds to their enemies. The major change is that Devastating Wounds are basically no longer mortal wounds, and in some cases this is going to be a buff to Devastating Wounds weapons, and sometimes it's going to be a nerf. The way that these work now is that if you get a critical wound, then you just get to ignore armor and invulnerable saves in a similar sort of way to mortal wounds would, but otherwise you don't get the spillover type effects that you get for mortal wounds. So say if you had something like an Aeldari Wraith Knight with a heavy Wraith cannon get a devastating wound, you'd no longer say killed 2d6 enemy infantry, you'd still just killed just the one model, as they don't count as mortal wounds anymore. You would still be able to get feel no pain type saves against them, as you could before when they were mortal wounds. I feel like for the most part it's quite a good change. It stops anti-tank weapons from somehow just deleting masses of infantry once in a while when they get lucky. But I would bear in mind in some cases this is going to be a buff to Devastating Wounds weapons. It's not going to change anything for things that had damage 1 and Devastating Wounds, like say Space Marine Assault Cannons, and for some units durability protection, like say Adeptus Custodes with their mortal wound defense. Devastating wound weapons are actually going to be better against those factions and options like Space Marine Terminator Chaplains, for example, as they're no longer mortal wounds, so you no longer get those saves. Overall, for the most part, I think this is probably going to be a change for the positive, though. Mortal wounds definitely still exist in the game, but now far less of them. Devastating wounds seem to be basically a kind of halfway house to them now. Perhaps the slightly more surprising one that was talked about in the leak the other day was the stratagems that you get modified for things like captains, Necron overlords, or certain debuff abilities. They can now only apply to ones that are classified as battle tactic stratagems. In general, up to now in 10th edition, the actual type of stratagem underneath the name of it has generally been kind of irrelevant. They're classed as things like epic deeds or strategic ploys and battle tactics. Say for example the Marines' Armour of Contempt one, that's a battle tactic stratagem. The rules change here has basically limited abilities like, say, captains or overlords from getting free stratagems on things that aren't battle tactics, so you basically have to look in your own index and see which ones are battle tactics, and then you can use those on the unit. This is going to be an absolutely enormous nerf to a lot of these characters. It really just depends on what battle tactics you have available. Perhaps one notable one is that you're not getting free Overwatch out of this anymore. That's not a battle tactic stratagem. It also applies to things that debuff stratagems as well, say the Swarm Lord or the Calidus Assassin's Reign of Confusion. They both increase stratagem cost, and again that's now only going to be applicable to battle tactic stratagems, though you could target the command point reroll, which is one. I guess that might be a popular kind of choice for these sort of units now. As well as that, this also applies to stratagems that can be used more than once per phase or turn, things like captains being able to use one stratagem more than once in a phase, so you still can't say use it to use a war gear stratagem twice per phase anymore. That's also going to be limited. Honestly, I found this one to be a bit of a surprising change. I feel like there's probably other ways they could have addressed it, and I feel like captains and overlords and the equivalents just went down in value a whole load. It's really going to be very faction specific, depending on whether or not you've got good battle tactic stratagems that makes it worth using these now. Another rather big core rule shake-up is Games Workshop trying to make Battleshock a bit more relevant, and for this one they've decided to set their sights on the Insane Bravery stratagem and nerfed it twice over pretty much. Insane Bravery is the one command point one to cancel Battleshock that can only be used in the Battleshock section of the command phase. Previously you could just do it to turn off Battleshock for the unit that you cared about the most, but now you're going to need to declare it before you've taken the test, so way less value there. You can't just wait to see the outcome of the dice and then only spend the CP if you need it. And also it's just restricted to a single time per battle now, regardless of army. And I genuinely think that this is going to make Battleshock and leadership a little bit more meaningful. It doesn't really change the value of anything that made Battleshock tests happen in your own turn or anything like that, as Insane Bravery doesn't really apply to them. I still think that maybe something like a test to regroup might not be the worst idea for Battleshock units, but I feel like this is probably a good step in the right direction. It's actually going to be pretty meaningful whether or not your units pass and fail now, and you can't just have your command point that you generated in the command phase just to turn off Battleshock where it's important, where you need it most every turn. Otherwise, for a big change to Overwatch, this has been nerfed in two different ways for certain unit types, basically artillery and titanic units. First up, you can't target units out of line of sight with Overwatch. That was something that was really quite powerful on things like Aeldari D cannons, but also other artillery things. I must admit it did feel a little bit on the weird side, where you could just move a unit up completely out of line of sight of the artillery, and then they just open fire on you, pretty much the same as any unit that could see you could. And secondly, just Overwatch is now flat out banned on Titanic units. So for big knights with a whole bunch of guns, or Imperial Guard Baneblades, or Orc Stompers or Gorkanauts, you're not going to be able to use Overwatch on any of them anymore. I feel like that's maybe not the worst idea in the world. Most of the time you would have been getting vastly more value out of those units with Overwatch compared with a lot of the more standard shooting things in the game, bar things like Flamers which kind of feel appropriate. But I feel like maybe it might have been more sensible to charge 2 command points for Overwatch on Titanic units perhaps. That way it's still an option, but just a very pricey one that you might not always want to make use of. I guess in particular it's particularly nasty for any big knights with flamethrowers and things. Say for example the Knight Valiant, you're not going to be able to Overwatch with that scary big flamer anymore. Sticking with towering units, the rules for Ruins visibility has also been changed, and I guess this is Games Workshop's way to make towering weirdness go away a bit. I have brought it up several times over, but the discrepancy between a blocked-in ruin and a windowed ruin felt very silly versus knights and things. This does seem like it will be something that fixes this, but also something that really quite fundamentally changes towering rules as well, which I wasn't really expecting them to do. Basically, the towering keyword is just going to be a lot less impactful overall. I suspect it's broadly generally going to be a nerf for things that had towering and wanted to shoot the enemy, but broadly going to be a buff for towering things that wanted to charge into melee and might want to hide behind terrain. The way that the rules has been changed for the ruins is that now it's just aircraft that can basically draw a line of sight regardless of ruin cover. And now the only thing that towering does is that towering models can essentially see through the terrain if they're at least partially within it, not wholly within it. Usually the way that ruins and blocking line of sight works is that if you're partially in a ruin but not wholly within, your unit can be shot, but then it can't shoot out of it, even if you could see people the other side of the ruin if you had to draw line of sight through it. Now though, this is basically going to be a buff for things like knights and monoliths just towing into cover. If they can tow into the ruin and get partially within it, then it means that they'll be able to shoot over and through it, obviously provided they could actually draw a direct line of sight in the first place. It pretty much is a direct tone down of towering rules though, as you could do this anyway regardless of whether or not you were in or out of the ruin. The towering keyword just became way less impactful. It does mean though that things like knights and wraith knights, if they're wholly behind an obscuring ruin, then you just won't be able to shoot them regardless of whether or not you can draw a physical line of sight to them, so it means that knights and things will be able to hide if there's got a ruin big enough to fully obscure them and they're not within that ruin. This is broadly a buff to things like the Knight Lancer or Knight Gallant that don't really care about shooting you too much, but do care about being shot and basically don't want to be. Kind of an interesting change. I feel like it's probably good that they fixed the rule in some way. Not necessarily sure it needed to go this far with it, But basically the upshot is that now things like Monoliths, Wraith Knights and Imperial Knights, they're all going to operate a lot more like just regular units unless they're towing into cover. Let's get into faction-specific rules changes, and I'll try and go through the major points things in brief. I might make a few more focused videos on the factions as I get round to them. First up, for the Space Marines, it does seem that squad size change for the Desolation Marines is confirmed. We've got Desolation Marines going down to maximum of 5 squads, and their points cost has been nerfed to 200. These guys definitely were still seeing a lot of competitive play, either in core Space Marines with a Bolt of Discipline Warlord in the unit, or in Death Watch with the anti-infantry shots. But basically these guys have got way less efficient, both in terms of stratagems and leaders, and you can just take far less of them overall now due to the rule of 3, meaning that you'll usually just have 15 max. I feel like their usage is going to drop off quite a lot as a result. Otherwise though, the Space Marines have seen a lot of points changes. A bunch of their good stuff has actually been nerfed, but a whole bunch of the weaker things have been buffed, and often quite significantly. For the nerfs, the Gladiator Lancer gets one of the worst, going up to 160, though I still think it's probably going to be efficient enough with that enormous anti-tank gun with the built-in rerolls. Infiltrators have gone up to 100, though I still think they're probably okay given that they deny the deep strike. Still, that's a pretty powerful ability for holding down a home or midfield objective. Stern Guard are up very slightly. Arguably they might be kind of winners out of the devastating wounds thing, as mortal wound defense won't work against them anymore. The Stormspeeder Thunderstrike is up a fair bit, up to 170 for its big damage buffs against vehicles, and the Terminator Assault Squad's gone up very slightly to 205. Maybe a little bit unnecessary, that one. I don't think that they were overpowered, but then it's not really the biggest change in the world either. Broadly speaking though, the buffs are really quite big, and I feel like they fall on a lot of the right units. Perhaps Games Workshop want to sell some Terminators as they went down to 190 despite being kind of fine already. Aggressors are 100 from 110. Assault Intercessors, Heavy Intercessors, Incursors, Infernus Marines, Intercessors, Reavers and Scouts are all down. I feel like the Intercessor variants going down is pretty sensible, as they were kind of rarely seen. They'll all be a little bit more tempting now. Scouts down at 65 I think is also very interesting. That's really quite cheap for setting up in the midfield. The Ballistus Dreadnought dropped significantly down to 150. He'll compete far better with other anti-tank type options. The regular Dreadnought's 135. Outriders and the ATV are down a little bit each. Still not convinced that Outriders are going to be very exciting at 105 though. The Centurions go down quite significantly. 150 for the Assault ones, 175 for the Devastator ones. They look a lot more interesting. I feel like perhaps one of the biggest changes are the Eliminators down to 75. They were already played competitively before when they were 95, so 75 seems excellent for them. I guess the devastating wounds on their last fusils will be a bit weaker though. The Gladiator Reapers and Valiant are both down to 150, so slightly better there, and will be a lot more balanced against the Lancer. The Impulsor's down to a mere 85, which I think is quite good. Really nice to have that as a properly cheap transport now. I genuinely think that that's going to get taken now. Land Raiders are down to 240. Vanguard Veterans get one of the single biggest points decreases, all the way down to 105 from 130. And lots of characters went down small amounts, besides Rabute Gilliman, who's up to 380. Overall, I'd say that Space Marines are broadly going to be a little bit stronger after this, though I do feel that hitting some of their top units when they weren't exactly doing particularly exciting already was perhaps a little bit questionable. I'd say perhaps some of the biggest winners are the Vanguard Veterans, Terminators and Eliminators perhaps. Biggest losers probably the Desolation Squad, and a lot of the rest of the good stuff I think is still worth taking. Otherwise, for the Marine changes, no points increases besides some Wolf Scouts which went up to 85. The rest have got a lot of drops across the board. For their key stuff, Bjorn the Fell-Handed went down to 180, which is very nice seeing as he was already getting played quite a lot. I feel like he is basically auto-include now. Wolfen are far more exciting at just 80 points. I think they were perhaps usable but underwhelming at 100. Thunderwolves are down to 90 and they were already being taken a fair bit. All the other Dreadnoughts dropped down, including their unique Wolfen one. Logan on Storm Riders down to 185, so a massive 50 point drop there. And there's small decreases for most of their other stuff and most of their characters. I noticed Ragnar's down to 90 from 105 points. Quite good that Games Workshop gave these Space Wolves some love here, though it doesn't look like they've had any change to their core detachment rules. I still guess that the competitive way to play Space Wolves is sadly going to be Gladius, if they're not going to change the detachment at all. With more major changes, we've got the Death Watch that have currently been doing great competitively, often building around big blocks of Desolation Marines with anti-infantry, and Proteus and Death Watch veterans. These guys have broadly escaped any changes with the points, which puts them fairly unique compared with a lot of factions, though it's maybe a little bit disappointing that a few of the more niche things like the Corvus Black Star or a few of the less overwhelming kill teams didn't get support. The Death Watch have basically just had one big nerf, bar the Desolation Marines getting toned down, and that's to their special issue ammo stratagems, which now have a set list of weapons that they can affect, though it is a very, very big one, affecting basically every single minor bolt weapon in the codex, though not things like heavy bolters. It means that you can't get anti-infantry on things like Hellblasters or Desolation Marine Castellan launchers. It always maybe did feel a little bit weird to start with those sort of things. Those special bolt types had always targeted bolters in the first place. Not sure why they made them completely de-restricted on stratagems in the index, bar just for simplicity. Overall, probably going to lose a bit of power with that. I guess some of the other Space Marine datasheet buffs might help a little bit, and there might be some more room for some of those. For Dark Angels, it's all positive in terms of points changes, though I wouldn't say that anything has changed spectacularly. Again, no detachment changes, and theirs is pretty solidly worse than the Gladius for the most part. Things have just been very incrementally dropped here. Ravenwing Black Knights and Command Squads go down a little bit, the Deathwing Command Squad and Terminator Squad also drop a tiny bit, though the Deathwing Knights stay the same price, they did tend to get taken a bit more in general. I'd say perhaps the biggest winner of the update might be to new and snazzy Azrael at 105 points. Previously he was 120, but at 105 I think he's getting into the territory of basically auto-include really, for the amount of buffs he gives his units, plus an okay melee stat line. For the Blood Angels, seemingly perhaps the most struggling of the unique chapters by the stats, they've got a massive boost of the Sanguinary Guard. They were massively overcosted at 215 before, now they're 175 for a squad of 5 of them, so I guess essentially 35 points per model. They are much better than they used to be, and they still have a good general purpose profile. Whether or not that's enough to make them actually very strong for the Space Marines is a bit of another question though. I can't help but think they might still get outcompeted with Death Company with jump packs, which are down to 130 points for 5 of them, and they still hit very hard indeed with Power Fist and Inferno pistols, or maybe Thunder Hammers if you want to go with full rerolls and fish for devastating wounds. The Dreadnoughts are down a little bit as well. Most characters went down a little bit, though I'd say perhaps one of the most outstanding might be Lamartes, down to 110 from 135, and Astaroth down to 85 from 100. But both Dante and Sanguinary Priest went down as well, and they were both good already. I guess things might change around when the new Space Marine Codex comes out. Will be interesting to see what squads are worth supporting with the jump characters, and particularly how things shake out with jump intercessors replacing assault squads. I guess Vanguard Veterans being super cheap at 105 points with jump packs now is looking really quite interesting. Next up, for the Black Templars, I feel like these might be the single biggest winner out of the Space Marine chapters. For tournament performance, they were doing better than Dark Angels, Space Wolves and Blood Angels, kind of similar to standard Gladius Space Marines. Their units are very efficient and often taken, and have just got huge buffs to them. Black Templar Space Marines were already very cheap, but Games Workshop seems to have made them ludicrously so now. A standard Firstborn Crusader squad somehow gets you 10 Space Marines for 125 points. Somehow that Space Marine profiles for the same sort of cost as Sister Battle Dominions even after the points cost went down, and they can still take a few fun bits of gear and heavy weapons in that. The Primaris Crusader squads definitely look like they compete with those though. They do get a bunch more attacks, and they're 140 points for 10 of them, 280 for 20. 14 points per Space Marine body there is great. Sword Brethren went down to 140 points, and they're already really quite efficient combatants, not quite as tough, but still pretty brutal. Grimaldus was excellent already, and he went down to 95, a whopping 25 point drop, and Helbrecht and the Emperor's Champion went down as well. Overall, I'd say that it's a massive win for the Black Templars. All their unique stuff was generally pretty good already. Maybe not stand out in the context of entire 40k, but I feel like it might be now. That definitely puts you at the level where you could very easily put 100 Space Marines on the board, and still have plenty of room for some extras. Otherwise, for the Imperial factions, the Adeptus Custodes got some nerfs perhaps as expected. Again, with the leak the other day, it does indeed look like squad sizes are changing. The Wardens have gone down to 5 models from 6 models per squad, kind of makes sense as that reflects their kit, and the Custodian Guard dropped down to 5 model units from the big 10-man squad that they had, which is going to limit stratagem and character efficiency. They're definitely not going to be quite as oppressive for countering melee compared with what they used to. And it looks like Games Workshop has slightly nerfed the Fights First stratagem that they had. You can basically no longer get it for free with a shield captain anymore, as it's now an epic deed, and you can only use free stratagems on battle tactics. Maybe not the worst change in the world. I did feel like that one was somewhat oppressive to melee units. At least you can still use it if you're willing to spend the CP now. Otherwise, perhaps as expected, it's generally small points increases to most of their good units. essentially 5 points on all the good Custodians, with Allarus up to 70 points, Custodian Guard up to around 50 points per model rather than 45, and Wardens up to 55 points per model from 50. I still think that they'll all be pretty decent units at that level, though no longer just outclassing other units they're fighting by quite so much. Otherwise, a few of the better characters have gone up: Trajan Valoris, the Blade Champion, and the Shield Captains. The Caladius Grav Tank escaped unchanged at 215 points, so I'm sure we'll be still seeing a whole bunch of those. And to be fair to them, Games Workshop have actually been brave enough to put a few things down as well. Virtus Praetors down to 160 points for 2 or 240 for 3. The Venerable Land Raider down a little bit. Vigilators and Witch Seekers both down to 50 points per 4, though Prosecutors will still be cheaper if you want the cheaper Sisters unit. And a whole bunch of the Forge World Custodians have dropped down to far more usable levels: Sagittarium at 225 and a Venetaria 200 for 3. Overall, I'd say that they probably are going to be a bit weaker after these changes. Definitely the big blocks of Custodians backed up by enormously efficient characters and stratagems with fights first is definitely toned down a fair bit. Perhaps not too unexpected though, as they were somewhere towards the top of the meta, bar things like Aeldari and Genestealer Cults, and pretty hard to beat with most factions. I still think that they'll do fine. For the Imperial Guard, they'd been down towards the bottom of the 40k power spectrum, and Games Workshop has generally hit things pretty hard with buffs. Only a couple of things went up, and broadly the fairly effective artillery that they've got has been left unchanged. The main unit that went up was Scout Sentinels from 50 to 60, but I feel like that's not the end of the world really. They're still very good for what they do. Weakish shooting, but a surprising amount of melee that can chew through some infantry in a few turns. Massively tough for the cost, and can be recycled with the stratagem. Otherwise, the main nerfs fell to niche Forge World stuff. Rapier laser destroyers are a little bit worse, and Games Workshop seem to have decided that they really don't want people playing the Earthshaker carriage or Medusa carriage. Both of those have gone up kind of astronomically to where I wouldn't really consider them versus a Basilisk or Manticore. For the core codex though, it's basically very good news. The infantry squads are far more balanced. Death Corps of Krieg remain unchanged, but the regular Cadians and the regular infantry squad are down to 60, and Caschans just 55. Could be justifiable for a cheap scout moving squad now. Bulgrins, Ogrins, and Rattlings all went down small amounts. I feel like they are actually genuinely kind of interesting for the sheer amount of wounds that you put on the board now. Tempestus Scions drops a little bit down to 55, definitely useful to have some of those around for jumping on secondaries and stuff. Kazakin got a very good buff, going from 120 down to 100, far more playable, as well as Chimeras dropping too, and Rough Riders are down to 70 from 80. I think perhaps at the top of the wish list for Guard though was changes to their armour. Rogue Ordorns are down to 260, all the Lehman Russes dropped around about 15 to 20 points ish, the Demolishers 200, the Exterminators 180, Vanquishers are just 155, Chimeras at 70 points are looking very efficient indeed, and a few of the Baneblade chassis tanks went down, particularly the Baneblade and the Hellhammer saw the biggest drops, taking around about 50 points off. The Valkyrie dropped but just a little bit to 190, and I still think that's far too overcosted for what it is. And beyond that, a few of the lesser played characters went down a bit, though not Lord Solar Leontus. Perhaps one of the most surprising changes was Gaunt's Ghost dropping down to 100. They're really quite commonly played competitively, so not entirely sure why that one happened so much, but I guess people are still going to take them. Overall, I feel like this is a really big step in the right direction for the Guard. I don't think it's going to make them top tier, to be honest, but definitely a lot more of a solid mid-tier army with getting a lot more units on the board. Glad to see that you're not going to be punished quite so heavily for taking Russes along now. Next up, we've got the Grey Knights, who also seem to have a story of massive points cuts. They were one of 40k's weakest factions going into this update, although a few people could have some success with them with their big movement tricks. In general, they just lack the strength to really kill the enemies once they actually engage them. The only rules change that they've had is their Haloed and Soulfire stratagem is now a strategic ploy, not a battle tactic, so that means that you can't use it for their cheaper stratagem. That's the one that keeps one unit safe from long-range shooting. In general though, I think it's good news for most of their units. All the characters went down a fair bit. Maybe perhaps particularly notable ones are Caldor Drago, who is 125 now. He was already kind of auto-include at 155, I thought. The Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knight is also far more efficient at 200 from 245. Hopefully can do a bit of heavy lifting against tanks now for less cost. The regular Dread Knights are 185, and I feel like are a lot more interesting as one of the units that actually uses their detachment rule quite well. Big cuts to all the power armoured Grey Knights, Strike Squads 125, Purifiers and Purgation Squads 130 and 135, and Interceptors 135 as well. I feel like a lot of the specialists catch up a lot on the Strike Squads there. The Purifiers in particular I think are looking really quite interesting, as they were kind of good before with Castell and Crow. And I feel like that's a level where purgation squads might actually get played with a bunch of psi cannons jumping around the board each turn. 190 was kind of ridiculous for them. The standard Terminators were maybe one of the more played units, but still see a small drop, and the Paladins go down to 225, so catch up with them quite a lot. Again, I thought they were already quite good with their -1 to wound debuff. My guess is that this should have Grey Knights competing a lot better than before, though I still think that they're going to be a faction that's got massive power differences depending on how well you use their movement tricks. In a really experienced player who knows exactly what to do with them all the time, I feel like they're going to be a very tricky army to fight now they've got a lot more units on the board, but still aren't just going to be an army where you can just throw units into the fray and expect to win. Perhaps one of the biggest losers from the update, I feel, are probably the Imperial Knights. They definitely were an army that was declining in the tournament stats given the towering changes and their previous points increases. A lot more people seem to be building to deal with them. But in general, Games Workshop seem to have slapped them with a lot of individual rules nerfs, but not really changed the points too much this time round. First up, that towering change is definitely going to be a big nerf to them, given that they're quite shooting heavy. They're not going to get anywhere near as many lines of sight as before. No, Overwatch is pretty massive with things like Crusaders and Valiants not being able to put a whole load of hurt on one unit that strays too close, and then they've got a whole bunch of faction-specific stuff on top of that. I feel like perhaps one of the most surprising ones is that Bondsman abilities have been changed so they no longer affect the Big Knight anymore. That was a big change in 10th edition, but Games Workshop have basically just nerfed Questoris as a whole really quite a lot with that. You won't have Crusaders hitting on a 2+ anymore, or Wardens with a -1 damage. I feel like that's perhaps a little bit unfortunate from a flavour point of view. I did quite like the way this actually helped out both the pairing now and not just the armature. I feel like I perhaps would have preferred them to increase points cost if they had to reflect that, rather than actually remove the rule for the Questoris themselves. Still helpful for the armatures of course, but far less good overall. Otherwise they've basically got 3 stratagem nerfs on top of that. It's 2 command points for the +1 to wound trophy claim, which is a big damage boost, but now you're paying lots of command points for it. It's 2 CP to fight in death rather than just 1, and this will be for armatures and big knights as well, so again that's going to get used more rarely. And also Thunderstorm's been changed to an epic deed, so I guess that means that you're not getting it for free with Canis. Finally, there have also been some points nerfs on top of that. Helverins go up to 150 points, so +5 there. Warglaves are up to 150 as well, so +10. I feel like that's going to sting really quite a lot, given that Warglaves are pretty much the battle line of the Imperial Knights for the most part. And finally, Canis Rex has dropped 30 points to 460, though that is, I guess, in compensation for his free stratagems being far less good. I think the only battle tactic they have is Shoulder the Burden now. Overall, really quite a brutal set of nerfs there. I feel like Canis maybe has come out of it slightly improved still. He's still got very chunky stats and he is a lot cheaper, even if the free stratagems are worse. But between a bunch of core nerfs plus a bunch of specific nerfs, the faction's really going down a long way. I suspect they're going to be far more manageable by a lot of the rest of the field, and I feel like they're seriously going to struggle against any of the top factions now. Not that they were really winning that many tournaments in the face of Aeldari and Genestealer Cults and things recently. Next up, the Omnissiah has delivered for the Adeptus Mechanicus. The main thing they've delivered is a massive boost to the standard Skitarii troops, which have gone from being really quite bad to genuinely kind of good, I think. Rangers went down a long way from 125 all the way down to 90 points, though they were quite overcosted before. Vanguard dropped down from 100 to 80 points, but perhaps more importantly they also gained a 4+ base save and a 5+ invulnerable, in line with a bunch of the other units in the index. Just in general, they're actually going to be troops that are fairly tough for holding the battle line now, and cost far less investments to get some good objective control on points. Otherwise, no major rules changes, though perhaps not too surprising seeing as we know that the Codex is coming in winter. The Omni Sterilizer will be a little bit toned down, given that the devastating wounds won't splash to multiple models anymore, but still it generally gets a fair few hits on the enemy, and against the right sort of heavy infantry or monster type targets, it's still going to be brutal. Otherwise, for points changes, it's pretty much drops across the board, though mostly kind of small to medium ones. Cataphrone Breachers and Destroyers both drop a bit, despite being some of the best units in the index. The Sindonian Dragoon lot drops a lot down to 60 points from 75. Fulgurite Electro Priests have one of the biggest drops in the index, down to 60 from 80. They look genuinely interesting, jumping out of a Dune Rider now perhaps. Corpuscari are just 55 for all the shots they get. Ruststalkers are 70 and Infiltrators are 70 as well. I feel like Infiltrators are still probably looking more interesting out of those two. The Taraxi units drop down a little bit, still handy enough to have Wingy around for doing secondaries and things. Cerberus Raiders and Sulphur Hounds both come down, really quite a tiny amount of points that you get for the money now, and Mecha getting it ever more expensive to have a 2,000 point army of here. The Scorpius Disintegrators down to 180. I feel like that's gained some ground against the Onager, seeing as they kind of competed for a role. It still looks like one of the better ways to deal some anti-armor damage with Admech right now. Castellan robots are down to 200. Several characters get small drops, as do the Fuselav Transvector. Perhaps it's clearer to see the things that haven't changed: Onagers, Stratoraptors, Dune Riders and Iron Striders, Belisarius Core, and a couple of the Tech Priests. Overall, I feel like it's a lot of fairly feel-good changes in terms of making the units more efficient in-game. Definitely does feel like they made Admech into a bit more of a hoardy army, which I'm not sure everyone will like. They were already one of 40k's most expensive factions to get 2,000 points with, and now they're even more so. I'd guess these changes are probably enough to put them a lot closer towards the mid-tier, but I still don't think they're going to be one of the standout good armies of 40k. Next up for the Adepta Sororitas, who are doing a little bit better than the Admech, but not much. Again, they're a case of sweeping points cuts, but mainly smallish ones. For them, the unchanged units are Sacrosants, Seraphim, Zephyrim, Mortifiers, Penitent Engines, Death Cult Assassins, and the Demonifuge. Everything else went down, bar Crusaders that went up very slightly, perhaps just to reflect their value of having very, very tiny units. I think they're still usable at 25 points for that role though. For the infantry, standard Battle Sisters are 100, and that does make sense to have some around for farming Miracle Dice. Dominions are 120, and I feel like they needed to go down more than that. Retributors are 115, and that's a lot more usable, though they're still very fragile. Repentia are down to 65 or 130 from 75 or 150. Still probably not standout good, but definitely lots more interesting. Arcoflagellants are 40 points or 130. I feel like they were already kind of interesting in my book. You can put out a silly amount of stacked saves, even if they're not going to be that good against vehicles. For the heavy lifters, the Paragon suits are just 200 now, so a big 40-point cut on them, and Val's 125 despite being already pretty efficient, I thought. I feel like a squad of those and Val is looking a lot more tempting. The Castigator and Exorcist and Immolator all go down around about 10 or 15 points. The Rhino's 75 as well. And then for the characters, maybe a standout one is the Triumph of St. Catherine down to 125. That's very cheap as it was already kind of annoying to remove in the first place. Astrid and Agatha with their devastating wounds are 55. Celestine's 135 and she was already fairly good. And most minor support characters went down by a small amount as well. They're still definitely going to be an army with their weaknesses, with short range and limited anti-tank. They're not going to be able to fall back on quite as efficient armigers either, but broadly speaking a step in the right direction. Whether it will be enough is another question though, perhaps. Next we've got the Agents of the Imperium, and as expected exaction squads were nerfed. They are indeed locked to a 10-man squad size and 110 points, so huge points nerf and squad size nerf combined in one. They're not really going to get taken anywhere near as much with this. As expected, Games Workshop wants to keep them niche. Otherwise, the very commonly played Calidus Assassin went down from 115 to 90 points, still probably usable to use Reign of Confusion on the command point reroll, which is a battle tactic, and she can jump on and off the board to do some secondaries still. Voidsman at Arms also went up slightly at 50 points for 5 compared with 40. Looks like if you just want a cheap chaff and objective holding units, you might go for Inquisitorial Henchmen. They're still just 40 points for 5 of them with 2 wounds apiece. Could still be handy for armies like Imperial Knights that just want some grunts to sit on objectives. The Vindicator escaped any points changes despite being really quite commonly included in Imperial lists. I feel like he'll still be interesting to a number of factions. Onto the Chaos Forces now, and no major rules changes for the standard Space Marines. They were kind of doing wellish competitively with a win rate of 48% despite the other big scary things around, but it does look like Games Workshop's given and taken a bit, with some points increases to some key things, but a whole load of buffs as well. For the nerfs, Abaddon's up, Forge Fiends are up at 180, Master of Possession's up to 80 compared with 70, and Obliterators go up very slightly to 170 as well. I feel like the Forge Fiends may be a little bit painful, seeing as that was often a staple fire support piece, though it could certainly belt out a whole bunch of devastating wounds, which I suppose have also been toned down. I'm not sure Abaddon was necessarily that needed to go up. I feel like he was kind of fine where he was, though I suppose it might just reduce the efficiency of the overall Death Star with him and Terminators. There were a lot of points cost to compensate though. Maybe the single biggest winner might be Warp Talons, which went down kind of unexpectedly to just 100 points for 5 models. They look genuinely quite strong now. Raptors are down to 90, though I feel like I'd rather take Warp Talons for that cost. The standard Legionaries will definitely have a bit more focus on them at 90 points rather than 100. They can still get some fun gear. Possessed and Chosen were both pretty good units already, and they dropped by 5 points each. Not enormous, but they're still going to get played. Bites went down to 85 points. The Venom Crawler drops to 120 from 140, and that one's looking a lot more interesting as a generalist marine killing type thing now. And maybe one of the other winners could be the Hellbrutes dropping down to 140 from 155 for his aura of getting double dark packs out. That actually seems really quite good now, and even if his damage output isn't amazing, I'd still be tempted to take one. Vashtor's going down to 190 from 225, though I still think it's probably a bit underwhelming compared with the other options. Otherwise, a bunch of other things did go down a little bit. The Spawn, the Lord Discordant, the Vindicator, Dark Apostle, Defiler, and Fabius Bile. Overall, a bit of give and take there, maybe winding up broadly similar to how they were strength-wise. A few of their good units did go down, and I feel like Warp Talons are fun. Though the increases to Forge Fiends and Obliterators might sting a bit, quite a lot of lists did tend to use those. For the Legions of Chaos, the Death Guard are one of the armies that needed the most help in 40k, with one of the worst win rates at tournaments and just a kind of bland index overall. Games Workshop did definitely give them a whole bunch of big points decreases, so they are going to be feeling a bit more hoardy and unelite compared with what they were before, but they did actually choose to go down and give them another faction rule, as I think they were one of the armies that had the least from their faction detachment rules of any of them in the game whatsoever. The faction buff that they gave them isn't a new form of disgustingly resilient, as a few people were kind of hoping for, maybe a feel no pain or -1 damage once more, but that has not materialised. Instead, what they're getting instead of that is a buff to their Contagions of Nurgle. This comes with their Plague Company rule, and it just makes the Contagions extra good. At the start of the game, as well as the -1 toughness that you get already, you then get to pick one of these 3 debuffs to further layer on the Contagions ability. Either worsen enemy weapon skill or ballistic skill by 1, that's pretty much always going to be a -1 to hit in combat, which isn't bad. A more damaging and offensive one with worsening enemy saves by 1, that's really quite a big deal, as well as -1 toughness. If you can get a big armoured unit in contagion range, that's going to be far easier to kill. And then also a -1 leadership and -1 objective control to a minimum of 1, that could be handy enough for toughish units fighting over midfield objectives. They still retain that sticky objectives rule that spread contagion range as well, that's not lost. Overall, I think that that's a genuinely good rule to add on. You get to pick which one of them is going to be the most impactful in each game, which is really nice, and some of those are going to add a lot of value. Otherwise, points costs were fairly generous. Plague Marines are now just 16 points per model, so very cheap compared with the 20 they were before. They still get all their gear for free. Still might not be feeling the most elite in the world, but per points their durability is genuinely quite good now, I think. Just that many wounds at toughness 5 is going to be hard for some armies to deal with. Otherwise, Poxwalkers and Cultist chaff is cheaper at 50 points. Death Shroud Terminators are 125 down from 140, not bad on perhaps one of the best units they had already. Blightlord Terminators got a smaller decrease, though I'm kind of surprised at that, given that I think that they were worse than the Death Shroud really. Literally all the characters are cheaper. Mortarian's down to just 325, so he's looking extra good. The Bloat Drone is just 100 points, and that's one of the biggest drops, down 35 points from 135. These look great now for getting those contagions out up the board a bit earlier. The Plagueburst Crawlers see a small drop along with the Lord of Virulence. The Blight Whores are down to 100 from 115, so good close range anti-tank or anti-elite. And a bunch of the Chaos stuff went down by maybe slightly meaningless amounts, going down around about 5 or 10 points. Overall though, Games Workshop definitely have given these guys some solid boosts. Plague Marines in particular are way stronger for the cost, even if they are going to feel a bit hoardy. I think Death Shroud are still looking absolutely standout and will get played a lot. And maybe Mortarion and Bloat Drones are other big winners there. Overall pretty good. I'm sure that will help Death Guard rise up the rankings in power. Thousand Sons were one of the previous strongest armies, though far below the likes of Aeldari and Genestealer Cults. No core rules changes for them. They were quite good before already, and the spells were pretty fun and impactful, and still are. For the most part, Games Workshop has given these guys some small nerfs, but I wouldn't say it's going to be to the extent where it's going to absolutely ruin the faction. 10 points on a Rubric squad, 10 points on a Scarab squad, Magnus up 30 and Mutaliths up 20. Most of the Sorcerers up around about 5 to 15 points, though Ahriman hit a bit harder at 20 points extra. For some reason Predator tanks and Maul Fiends went up a little bit, which is kind of surprising, though they did get some buffs to some lesser played stuff, with the Cultists and Demon Prince dropping down a bit, the Demon Prince really quite significantly, and the Vindicator and Land Raider going down. I must admit I don't think that this will be a very good feels-good update for Thousand Sons players. A lot of their most iconic and cool stuff got significantly worse compared with the more generic stuff that a lot of players don't care about quite so much. If taking similar sort of things, a lot of lists might lose between 100 and 200 points worth of models. I feel like they are going to be heading down from where they were down into the more mid-tier section of 40k armies, even if a bunch of the other stuff near the top was taken down a bit too. Finally, for the unique Chaos Legions, we've got the World Eaters. They were another army that just wasn't doing so well, with most of their stuff feeling overcosted, and kind of as predicted, Games Workshop didn't really do anything too intelligent with these guys, just literally slashed the points costs on most of their frontline damage dealer units, which to be fair I think is what they really needed. Khorne Berserkers are 100 for 5, down from 115, and Rhinos to get them into battle are just 75 from 85, so that entire setup's going to be a lot better. The big 8-bound Alpha Strike with a bunch of scouting models got way cheaper, 135 points for the 8-bound and 150 for the Exalted with their Deep Strike. Terminators are down to 190, so a slightly smaller decrease for them, though I did think that they were okay before. Jackal's down just a little bit, still handy enough for holding down home field objectives. Mauler Fiends a little bit cheaper, and I thought they were pretty hard hitting already. Hellbrutes 140, Helldrake's down a tiny bit, and most characters down around about 10 or 20 points besides the Master of Executions. Again, it looks like one of the only things that actually went up was the Forge Fiend, going up to 170 from 150. I guess World Eaters are all about the combat, but seems maybe a little bit weird to just hurt one of the only reasonable ranged units in the Codex. Overall, you basically just get a whole load more angry guys with big axes for your points cost. In general, I think it's going in the right direction. I'd guess that we're probably going to see a fair few more 8-bound in play again after this. For the big stompy war machines of Chaos, the Chaos Knights were doing broadly mid-tier-ish in 40k prior to these updates, and they will suffer from a few of the major things that changed Imperial Knights, like Overwatch and towering things getting debuffed a little bit, though as they tended to be a little bit more reliant on War Dogs before, that might not impact them quite as much as the Imperials perhaps. Broadly speaking though, I feel like their points changes have perhaps been surprisingly negative. The best War Dogs in general went up a bit, the Brigand going up to 160 and the Huntsman and Stalker both at 150, all I think still playable at those points costs but not really very helpful. Maybe the most disappointing one is the Executioner going up from 135 to 150, it feels a lot worse than the Brigand at that kind of differential. They did get a couple of points decreases, the Rampage is down to 380 from 395, still probably going to be kind of borderline versus the Chaos Lancer though with its big invulnerable save. I'd say by far the biggest winner out of the detachment is the War Dog Carnivore. That drops from 160 down to 140, and they were already pretty playable at 160. I feel like a few of those are borderline auto-include in a Chaos Knights army now, though I still probably wouldn't go absolutely all out on them and go too heavy, as I think it's diminishing returns after you've got a few to fill out the front line. Overall, I'd probably say that Chaos Knights are probably going to be a little bit weaker after this though, still having really quite big stat lines that some armies might struggle to deal with. They feel like compared with their Imperial Knights, they've probably lost less than the Imperial Knights did out of this update, and they'll both be a bit more balanced against each other, if slightly weaker. Finally, for the Realms of Chaos, we've got the Chaos Demons. Again, no major faction rules updates, and they were doing sort of okay competitively beforehand, though list builds were pretty limited and really focused around the greater demons. In this update, they have nerfed a lot of the things that seem to be in the cookie-cutter competitive Chaos Demons army build, but have given out far more points cuts to a whole bunch more different units, so I feel like overall the army might still get a tiny bit weaker from a pure competitive perspective, but have a lot more usable units. For the nerfs, Flamers are up to 80 points from 65, maybe not surprising as they were frequently being allied to jump around doing secondary objectives. Be'lakor and shielding his army from shooting is up to 350, though still reasonable I think, particularly with his shadow in the warp. The Lord of Change goes up to 260, so a bit more expensive. Shalaxi Hellbane is now looking probably prohibitively expensive, even if she is very dangerous, 450 over 400 there. The Bloodthirster's up at 320, a small nerf, and the Changeling's 90 points compared with 75. As mentioned though, a lot of stuff did go down. Basically all the lesser demons dropped by 20 points, bar the pink horrors which remain the same. Kinda nice for the Bloodletters, as I felt that they were really quite overcosted at 160. Demonettes in particular I think are looking very nice at 120. Nurglings are only 35 points now, kind of surprised at that, seeing as I thought they were very good for 3 models for 40 points and just going up the mid-board in the first place. Very good secondary units. For Slaanesh, Fiends are down to 130, they were a bit overcosted before. Seekers 85, the Skull Cannon's taken a big drop down to 105, could maybe be a bit more useful for Chaos Knight players that one and throwing out Battle Shock tests. Screamers are down to 80, the Burning Chariot 115, another big drop. The generic picks of the Demon Prince and Soul Grinder are both 200 versus 215, and the Nurgle Greater Demons dropped quite a bit, so the Great Unclean one's just 250. That's definitely a lot more even compared with the others. Loads of other stuff went down though. Beast of Nurgle, Hellflayers, Poxbringers, Karanak, Scarbrand Celesk, the Tormentbringer on Chariot, and the Bloodmaster. Kind of nice that Games Workshop did go pretty heavy and took a look at most of the units in the codex and hit a lot of the things that just weren't getting played very much. Xenos next, and starting out with the big bad Aeldari. As we've talked about in previous videos, these guys have been dominating tournaments to a frankly silly extent, a win rate hovering around about the 68 to 70 sort of mark, and just all around very strong units, particularly strong anti-tank stuff with their battle-focused rerolls. I guess the way that Games Workshop has toned down a couple of their things are with core rules changes. The devastating wound spilling over thing is going to be very big for things like Wraith Knights and D cannons, where they'll still be able to get those devastating wounds and punch through things like vehicles, but they aren't just going to be slewing through entire squads with them. I think Overwatch changes are also quite big for Aeldari. D cannons can't fire it out of line of sight, and Wraith Knights can't fire it in general. But then besides that, there's no changes to the automatic devastating wounds for Wraith cannons and things that they can key in. That's still going to be huge at gunning down enemy heavies. And the only actual core rule change that they decided to do was to Phantasm, easily the most powerful stratagem that they had in my opinion, with a huge reactive move with any unit on the board after the enemy had moved, so you could basically guarantee that you kept something safe. Phantasm is admittedly still there and it's still powerful, but it is limited to Aeldari infantry units now, so I guess it's now going to be a lot more restricted to things like Aspect Warriors, maybe keeping things like Warp Spiders more safe. As expected though, for the army that's just been utterly dominating tournaments so far, the points changes have been absolutely massive. For the most part, they tend to be in the region of around about 10 to 20% points increases, kind of what I was expecting for Games Workshop to do before, as I've mentioned in other videos. But these points increases don't seem to be faction-wide or anything, it broadly just very much is targeting the things that regularly comes up in tournament lists, which I think they have done quite well to be fair to them. Wraith Knights and support weapons both go up quite significantly. They were definitely some of the ones that people were expecting to go up, though I feel like it maybe is a little bit unfortunate for their alternate loadouts that are paying for the sins of the heavy Wraith cannons and the D cannons. Fire Prisms and their enormous rerolls and massive anti-tank are up to 180. Definitely paying a premium for their enormous anti-tank reliable shooting now. All the Farseers to manipulate the Fate dice have gone up a touch, as have all the Autarchs with their CP manipulation, the Wayleaper in particular going up more with his lone operative, which was kind of expected. Dark Reapers have taken a small increase up to 80 per 5 of them. Both of the avatars go up pretty significantly. The Avatar of Cain's plus 40 to 335, the Incarn, which was appearing in a ton of tournament lists, has gone up to 350 from 270, one of the biggest proportional increases of any of them there. Forge-World Hornets go up to 100 points, as do the Warp Hunter and the Lynx, also just things with very efficient Bright Lances, which admittedly they still have I think. Shadow Spectres are 95 points per 5, Warp Spiders are 115 per 5. Those skirmishing type units are going to be a lot more painful if they're lost now. Vipers are at 85, might still be okay as a luxury pick to get some focused ignores cover perhaps. The Harlequin Void Weavers 125, Illic Nightspear and his squad of Rangers only go up 5 points for Illic himself. That's kind of interesting as they were quite a common pick. Really quite an efficient sniper squad that also has lone operative type protection. I feel like they're still going to be an absolute staple. The Death Jester went up to 90 points, though I feel like maybe the reason that he was good was the Fate's Messenger enhancement, which is unchanged. Perhaps a bit of a weird way around to do it, that one. The Night Spinner went up very slightly at 180. That still definitely seems good. They were being used competitively still in good numbers. Azimun's up slightly at 135 from 120. Wraithguard went up to 170 from 155, and support weapons increased to 125. Overall, it is definitely a spectacular amount of points changes. A lot of Aeldari lists might lose somewhere around 200 to 400 points worth of models with that. And I guess with both Phantasm and the change to the devastating wounds and Overwatch thing is that this will significantly rein them in, probably a bit more in line with the top armies of the game as opposed to far ahead. Though I feel like even with these changes, based on how far they were ahead already, and the fact that their core mechanics aren't enormously different, I think they're still going to be pretty good. They do have plenty of other units that weren't touched as well that are still absolutely fine, maybe things like Wind Riders and Shroud Runners, and their anti-tank firepower is still going to be pretty terrifying, and some of it kind of hard to catch up with still. Overall, probably for the best though that they got some heavy nerfs. Hopefully means Aeldari players don't have to feel quite so bad about just turning up with their faction anymore. On the other end of the Space Elf spectrum, we have the Drukhari, one of the ones that were struggling to catch up, with a lot of their index just revolving around lance spam. The Drukhari were struggling, but maybe not quite as much as the absolute bottom of the barrel. They've again got some fairly sweeping points cuts. Things like Witches going down to 90 points I think will be appreciated, Cabalites to 110, Incubi at 80 compared with 85, Helions and Reavers both dropping, same with Mandrakes, and Scourges dropping from 120 to 110. though I thought they were kind of interesting already with their lances and the move shoot move. Most characters are also down around about 10 to 20 points. Lilith being just 85 points now seems particularly stand out, as she was already quite good with some witches before. The things that are unchanged are the Grotesques, Talos, Kronos, Venom and Raider. I suspect that most of those are still good enough to get taken. The Kronos is very cheap for its defense. The only thing that did go up was the Ravager, which went up from 95 points to 115. I feel like that might counterbalance a few of these changes though. It does feel like a big square nerf to arguably the very best unit in the index for a struggling army, though hopefully between the rest of the units that went down, that's enough to outweigh it and not just be index Darklands. Next up, we've got the Tyranids, the faction that has the Codex come out this weekend. I feel like a fair few players might not be too happy about the changes happening here. I feel like the Codex might have set some slightly false expectations by having a bunch of points costs that are now going to be completely redundant, as it looks like the points changes from the balanced data slate neither really reflects the previous points that were from the index, nor the new points from the Codex. Seems to be about a mix of the both of them, and some of them have changed beyond that. I feel like perhaps compared with most of the other armies out here, there are just a few points changes that absolutely seem very, very weird indeed, which is kind of a shame because I feel like for quite a lot of the other armies, most of them seem at least fairly understandable. For things that went down a bit, it is quite nice that Genestealers go down to 85 points. They did see a rules nerf in the Codex, so I think that's kind of fair. They look a lot more interesting and the new models are fun. Hormagaunts are just 65 points, which is kind of interesting for the unending swarm, I think. Death Leaper's down a further 5 to 70 points, so is looking more auto-include than ever, and the standard Lictor drops down to 60 as well. A lot of people were bemoaning the loss of the invulnerable save, but now he's just 60 points. I feel like that's really not too bad for a lone operative of his calibre. The Screamer Killer Carnifex is down a tiny bit to 170, which I think is still a bit too much. Same with the Toxicrin at 180, still overcosted there, and Warriors with melee weapons are 85 or 170, still that's far north of where I'd really want to see them. Unfortunately though, a fair few things have gone up since either the Index or the Codex, and the Norn Assimilator is just a tiny bit more than what the Codex told it was. Not really enough to change their role though, I don't think. Zoanthropes have gone up to 110, which is a big nerf to one of the strongest Tyranid units there. Rippers are 20 points per base, but still absolutely worth it at that cost for just jumping up and doing secondary objectives. Biovores are 75 points each, but still at least one I think is absolutely auto-include for throwing spore mines around to do secondary objectives, or maybe delaying an advance towards a key objective turn 1. The Harpies rather unfortunately back up an extra 50 points compared with the Codex at 215, not worth taking. Barb Gaunts are slightly worse compared with both at 60 points, the Winged Tyrants 210 and the Standard Hive Tyrant 235, both a bit sad there as they were kind of good but I didn't really feel overpowered. The Forge World Hierodules went up, and then a whole bunch of things that went down in the Codex are now swiftly back up to what they were in the Index. Exocrines, Gargoyles, Harrispexes, Trigons, and Von Ryan's Leapers. Though to be honest, I don't really feel as bad about those ones, seeing as they're all usable already, I think. Then we get to the points changes that I feel like are probably some of the worst out of this whole balance update. The Swarm Lord went up to 270 despite his debuff CP ability getting worse. The Tyrannifex is up at a pretty awful 245 points despite his defense ability getting worse. The Hive Guard are up at 110 despite being kind of rubbish. The Spore Assist is back up to the index cost at 145 despite massive nerfs in the Codex. And the Spore Mines are 55 points, just again doubly underlining why you should never take them individually. They would have been bad at the Codex points cost. Overall, I would say it's maybe not the best news for the Tyranids, just a shame to have a few random points cost that seem to nerf reasonably good units for no good reason, the Tyrannifex and the Swarm Lord in particular. And I feel like it might take the shine off quite a lot of units in the new Codex. I still think they'll be able to compete at least reasonably well with certain builds. I definitely feel like the Vanguard Invader type stuff with Genestealers and Lictors are perhaps looking better than ever, so that formation is quite nice. Zoanthropes still seem to be playable, same with the Exocrine and Maleceptor and friends. Definitely taking some of the shine off some of the units though. Next up, we've got their cultist allies. The Genestealer Cults were again one of the strongest armies in the game, truly ridiculous win percentages at around about 65%, despite the terrifying Aeldari out there in the meta. They did do quite well into Aeldari specifically, which is perhaps part of the reason for that success though. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they have been hit fairly hard to a bunch of their key units. The biggest nerf by far is the change to their Cult Ambush army rule. All of the battle line units that previously would just automatically go back into Cult Ambush once slain now must actually roll for it. They're still odds on to in the first couple of battle rounds. They go back into a Cult Ambush on a 5+ base now, +1 to the roll if they're battle line, and then a further +1 to the roll if it's either battle round 1 or 2, so a 3+ for those sort of units early in the game. But still, this is going to amount to a big nerf for them. You're not going to get anywhere near as many points back as you used to, and even more so if your units aren't battle line. On top of that, a bunch of their units saw points increases, Aberrants up to 185, the Ridge Runner 85, Acolytes at 85 per 5 of them, Neophytes 90 per 10 of them, and characters often up around about 5 to 10 points, as the Clamorous, Nexus, Reductus Saboteur, the Locust, and the Biophagus, though plenty of the others stayed unchanged. Seems that Games Workshop want these guys to get the new Genestealers as well, with Pure Strains going down 5 points, so they're 85 points per 5 of them. To be fair, that's hard to be too annoyed at, given that the Genestealers in Codex Genestealer Cults were pretty underwhelming before. Overall, these are definitely some massive nerfs to the faction. Their core rule is definitely weaker than it was before, and their best units went up in points. Broadly seems sensible given their dominance though. It might push them a bit further back into being the sort of army that they tend to be, one where they might not have as much raw power as the other factions, but tend to excel in the hands of very experienced players that make the absolute best decisions in terms of their movement and their respawning mechanics. For the Tau Empire, it's big points decrease time. Along with Admech and Grey Knights, they seem to be one of the armies rounding out the weakest armies in 40k before, and Games Workshop have done similar to them, hit most of their units with points decreases pretty much across the board. The rule seems to be that almost everything has dropped, bar just a few of the good things. For standouts among the list, Riptides are down to 180 from 235, which is an enormous cut. I think they're absolutely going to be back in style with that kind of points cut going on. You could have 3 of them for just north of 500 points now, which is pretty crazy. Broadsides are another huge winner, going down to 90 from 110. Their fire support was already reasonably efficient at least. Stealth suits are great for taking the midfield, dropping down to 60 to 75 is another huge cut. Shadow Sun only got more auto-include, 100 points down from 140 when I think that she was already very reasonable before. And the other commanders are still very good, with Farsight dropping to 90 points with his tank shock style shenanigans if you want them, and other commanders going down 20 points-ish each. They're also great for leading crisis blocks. The crisis suits themselves didn't see quite as big points cuts, but perhaps not surprising given that they were often the heavy lifters of the codex. Ghost kills are down very slightly, again a competitive unit. The tanks all saw massive cuts, Hammerheads are 130, same for Skyrays now, Longstrike 140. I feel like the Skyrays may be looking like the single best points-wise out of those now. The infantry went down lots, Breaches are just 90 points, and Devilfish are 75. So that's Breaches and Devilfish for 165 points, when previously it would have run you north of 200 points, which is massive differences. Strikes are 80 to hold the line on the home field objective, Fireblades are just 40 and are more usable than ever, Pathfinder's 90, the Storm Surge 400, and Kroot went down across the board as well, with the standard Carnivores being super cheap at 55. Just in general, it looks like you're getting far more Tau per your points. Kind of hard to see how this isn't going to be an enormous power boost for them. I guess for these out of biggest winners, I'd say probably the Riptide is perhaps the single biggest one out of any of these. Loads of other stuff got significantly more interesting though, Skyrays and Broadsides being some of the other best mainline damage dealers now I think. Some Stealth Suits and Shadow Sun also seem basically auto-include as well in my book. Next up, for the Orks, I feel like they've done rather well out of these changes. Compared with armies like the Tau, they were doing significantly better than them. Though I guess they were an army that perhaps didn't have great internal balance, it looks like Games Workshop has given them a few points increases on just a few choice units, though beyond that it's a lot of points cuts all throughout. Perhaps most surprising is no major change to the struggling Plains or Buggies. Kind of weird that they didn't get looked at here, seeing as they were pretty bad already. But beyond that, quite a lot of the rest of the index did go down. For the increases, the Beast Boss went up to 100 points from 80, Trucks went up to 60 from 50, though are still fine at that cost I think, and Mech Guns went up to 55 from 45. I feel like the shine's been taken off them really quite a lot. Previously they were one of the most efficient fire support units, but now are just far more mediocre for the disadvantages that they have. Otherwise though, it's a whole ton of good stuff. Gretchen are perhaps one of the most surprising changes, being absolutely auto-include already, now going down to 40 points for your little units of runts. Kind of a surprise with that one to be honest. I think I would start an Orky list with at least 2 or 3 units of those at a minimum. Knobs are great, 105 from 115, they were fine already, so a nice boost to a good unit. Mega Knobs down to 60 points from 65 for 2 of them. Looters and Burners a bit more niche but also getting better. The Death Dread down to 130 from 150, though I'd still say it's probably a bit borderline. They weren't very good before. And the Gorkanaut and Morkanaut both see reasonable points decreases, but not quite on the same level as the Death Dread. The Kill Rig and Hunter Rig both go down 20 points. The Kill Rig did feel a little bit overcosted before. Deathcopters are 100 from 115 and War Bikers are 70 from 75, both more usable. And then there's just a whole slew of characters that went down by small amounts. I might not go through literally all of these at this point. Maybe highlights of these are the Nob on Smasher Squig down at 60 points, who's looking quite efficient. The Big Mech in Mega Armor is just 85 from 100 points. I think he was already very nice as a cool Orky Apothecary pretty much. And the standard War Boss I thought was already very good for 70 points. He's just 65 now. Very easy to include in a unit of Nobs. Overall, even with a few choice nerfs, I feel like this is a big win for Orks overall. Definitely for an internal balance for a whole bunch of units. Maybe Gretchen, Nobs and Mega Nobs some of the biggest winners out of the update. I guess the Mech Guns and the Beast Boss perhaps the biggest losers. Next up for the Tomb Worlds we've got the Necrons. Again for tournament performance, particularly with specific builds around Lichguard and Doomsday Arcs, they tended to be one of the stronger factions in 40k recently. And as a result, things have tended to be a bit harsher for them. Games Workshop's done a mix of pretty even points increases for their best stuff, unit decreases for their weaker stuff, though a few good things got buffed. I feel like overall, after these changes, they might wind up just a little bit toned down compared with where they were, but maybe with a few more interesting options and a few things a bit more balanced. For the nerfs, Crypto Thralls are very expensive now, 60 points from 40 if you do want to add them in for the extra durability in your Lichguard or things. Necron anti-tank firepower has been toned down a bit, with the Doomsday Arc going up to 210, that's pretty significant, and the Doomstalker up at 135. I feel like they're both just about usable at those sort of costs, but that is a pretty big proportional increase on both of those there. They might compete against each other a little bit better as well, with the Doomsday Arc coming off worse. The Hex Mark is 80 points versus 70, still seems usable for the nice counterfire type shooting. Lichguard are 115 compared with 95, probably not too surprised with that given what they do and how tough they are, particularly when buffed with loads of characters. The Reanimator's gone up slightly from 105 to 95, though not enough not to take it I don't think, provided you can keep it safe. The Locust Heavy Destroyers are up to 50 from 45, but still reasonable enough anti-tank fire there. And finally the Transcendent Catan is up to 300 from 280, there still doesn't seem to be any restriction on it taking the Semi-Eternal Weave at 10 points, and as a result I still think it's very good. On the flip side though, they have had plenty of points decreases. Illuminor Ceres is a big winner, down to 185 from 220. He certainly wasn't too bad before, and now he's going to be extra good with augmenting some warriors, and the warriors themselves have dropped down to 110 from 120. I say that perhaps is a little bit surprising, seeing as they weren't exactly a bad unit before, particularly when built around. I guess that means that they've had a bit of a swing versus the Lichguard. You might see a few more people building around the core Necron troops choice as opposed to their elite Guardians. The Scorpex went down to 100 from 110, so did the Ophidian Destroyers. Ophidians maybe a little bit more in line with their cost for jumping around the board doing secondaries, though they still are a little bit fragile perhaps. Scorpex and the Scorpet Lord seem a bit better for frontline melee damage dealing, though still a unit with a bit less synergy than some. Zarek the Silent King got a meaningful decrease, 420 versus 470. You don't need to feel as bad about putting him on the table again now. Triarch Praetorians are 120 versus 135, and perhaps one of the best buffs actually came to the Necron Monolith, 350 points versus 385 on a unit that was already at least fairly scary with damage and defense. I suppose you can't fire Overwatch with it anymore, and it won't have quite as good lines of sight, but still that does seem rather nice for the great big slab of obsidian with some scary death rays. Otherwise, a few characters got some small drops as well, Imitate the Stormlord and the Locust Lord being a couple of them. Overall, as mentioned, I feel like due to the hits on the and perhaps with the lesser played units not being improved enough to replace them, it's probably going to be a small overall power decrease for the Necrons. They're maybe not the worst changes in the world for internal codex balance, and a lot of their competitors at the top of 40k have been toned down. Finally, last but by no means least, we've got the Leagues of Votann. These guys were pretty much the most struggling army in Warhammer 40k so far. Perhaps as anticipated, Games Workshop have both given them a rules boost and also points changes. The rules boost helps out their judgment tokens with ruthless efficiency, and it basically just hands out a whole bunch more judgment tokens right from the start of the game to get the judgment ball rolling quicker. Previously, you just select one enemy unit for the automatic 2 judgment tokens. Now you get to choose 2 at Incursion, 4 at Strike Force, or 6 on Onslaught. And to be honest, that's kind of surprising that you're basically just able to mark 4 enemy units at Strike Force with +1 to hit and +1 to wound. Then to gain the command point boost that you have to try and get as early as possible in the game, you just have to kill any one of those and then you generate the CP. If you can kill one of them round 1, that's going to be 3 CP free extra, 2 CP if you can do it a bit later. Shouldn't be too hard though if you are marking multiple different targets. It's definitely going to be a power boost to the faction and make a few more of their units a bit more efficient. I must say it doesn't feel like the most interactive thing in the world. You just literally say that your units are better against certain enemy targets because reasons. I just feel like it might have been a bit more interesting to have some way in which you hand them out, perhaps making the rules of Carls better or something perhaps. In any case though, they definitely needed a boost and that's what was being given, and that's also combined with a whole load of points cuts to pretty much their entire index, not that they've got the biggest index in the first place. Hearthkin are 110 points down from 135, big cut there. Hernkin Pioneers are down to 90 points from 105. Brockir Thunderkin are just 25 points per model now with those pretty scary grav cannons and things, they're just 75. The Iron Here Hearthguard sees a slightly smaller points cut than the rest of them, though they were probably the best unit already. Chthonian Berserk sees the biggest relative points decrease, they drop from 135 to 100, so Votann have some moderately efficient melee again, they were kind of bad before. Sagittars are down to 100 points with their scout shenanigans, they feel like a reasonably feel-good unit to deliver Berserks now. The big firepower of the Land Fortress is just 225, not too bad for a Land Raider equivalent defensive profile there I think, and particularly because it'll be getting +1 to wound against a lot more targets now. Otherwise, Carls are 70 points, though you might have a tiny bit less use for them if you mark all your favourite targets with judgment tokens straight away, and the others tend to be around about 60 to 70, Uthar being still more expensive at 90, and I still think it's probably going to be worse than the rest comparatively. Overall, not too bad for the Leagues of Votann though, I feel like this is going to meaningfully make them stronger. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed my roundup of this absolutely enormous Warhammer 40k update. So much has changed, it's a bit silly, and it's really going to be interesting to see how all this shakes out with which armies wind up being stronger or weaker. I think as general as Games Workshop's updates go, this one is one of the better ones. A lot needed fixing, and I feel like they've been at least moderately ambitious with each army, flipping some of the best armies to being a lot more mid-tier, giving heavy buffs to the things that were struggling a lot, and then not being too afraid to mess around with a few of the mid-tier armies to make some of the weaker units a bit stronger, or stronger units a bit weaker. Obviously definitely not got everything right I feel like, some of the Tyranids changes were pretty weird, and I feel like the Chaos Knights maybe got some unnecessary nerfs. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on them though. What do you think has been done well or badly? I'll hopefully aim to follow this up with a few more similar videos on some of the factions, so feel free to check back if you'd like to see more like this, but in any case, a massive thank you for listening. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.